development of integration theories in Hungary. On the turn of the 18th and 19th century, during the era of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, the resulting modern national ideology started to blossom as well as the nation-states, which did not solely bring along a change in the history of ideas, but also had major political. The development of integration theories in Hungary. On the turn of the 18th and 19th century, during the era of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, the resulting modern national ideology started to blossom as well as the nation-states, which did not solely bring along a change in the history of ideas, but also had major political. From the beginning of the 19th century, the creation of nation-state frameworks became the dominant idea and the political aspiration of national movements for approximately 2 centuries. This brought along significant and continuous territorial rearrangements in Central and Eastern Europe. As a result of this endeavor, territorial framework of states and empires, which were previously considered stable, became precarious. This continuous challenge had to be faced by the Hungarian politicians, thinkers, and the whole of the politicizing public in the 19th century. Similarly to Central and Eastern Europe, the integration plans formulated in the 19th century show many general features in Hungary as well. However, the majority of these are of a nature that predicted the necessary fall of the concepts. By accepting that history is among other things the science about the past, the integration plans, by their alternative nature, are an equally important part of the past, regardless of whether the political environment provided opportunities to materialize. From the mid-19th century, the thinking of many peoples of the region, especially the Hungarians, was ruled by another factor of fear and uncertainty, and the increasing Russian expansion kept the need for security of the smaller nations on the agenda. The conception emerged around this time, which was still around in the 20th century as well, especially in the first half of it, that against German and Russian expansive efforts, only an organization or federation of the peoples along the provide an alternative and security. As Hungary was part of the Habsburg Empire in the 19th century, the Hungarian drafters of the integration plans started from the analysis of the general state of the empire. Chancellor Metternich himself, as the dominant Central European politician of the first half of the 19th century, was aware of the danger of the nation-state idea to the future of the Habsburg Empire. He envisioned the control and management of national movements by broadening the imperial framework, which, however, meant only postponing the solution of problems. The competence of Metternich allowed Austria to control course of events through a lifetime. However, the result only be delayed but not avoided. According to other theories, the pre-1848 era of the Habsburg reign was the period of missed historical opportunities. From the point of view of the was that the necessary compromise between the unity and diversity was not realized in time. Such a compromise that would have been the balance between historical and national federalism. In contrast to this solution, for Metternich, Central Europe meant only the unchanged existence of the Austrian Empire, the rule of Italy and Hungary, and the hegemony. First half of the 19th century, the idea of Miklós Wesselényi should be mentioned among the Hungarian representatives of the idea of integration, which preceded many similar drafts formulated in the region. Wesselényi, as a determining politician of the Hungarian reform era, originated his theory from the previously mentioned factors that threatened the integrity of Hungary. This is the movements of nationalities and the Russian and the German expanse threats. He warned of the danger of pan-Slavism and orthodoxy in his pamphlet Szózat a magyar és a szláv nemzetiség ügyében. Meaning speech on the matter of Hungarian and Slavic nationality. The work was published in Hungarian in 1843 and a year later in German. He also recognized the historical situation which determined the approach of most 19th century, and integrity of Hungary and the Habsburg Empire is closely linked. It was clear to the main leaders of the reform movement that this Hungary could only be maintained within the framework of the Habsburg Empire. Wesselényi's work was the first in Hungary in the period before 1848 which urged the reorganization of the empire under public law. The writings of the Hungarian Jacobins, 1794-95, there has long been the idea of organizing the parts of the absolutely controlled Habsburg Empire, belonging to the Hungarian crown, into a federal republic adapted to linguistic borders, although we do not know exactly what sources or samples did the drafters base their plans on. At the turn of the 18th and 19th century, the republican system seemed completely unacceptable, since it would evoke the very dangerous happenings of France. The experience of the revolutions of 1848 and 1849, actions of the great powers, and the anti-government actions of the Hungarian nationalities confirmed the decades-long concern of politicians and the public that Hungary's territorial unity and independence should be rightfully feared from the nation-state movements as well as German and Russian aspirations. After the fall of the revolution, a significant in many overseas countries, primarily in the United States, which was led by the most influential intellectual and political leader Lajos Kossuth, 1802 until 1894, the governor-president and most significant politician of the 19th century, who was not only the best-known Hungarian politician in Europe, but also in the overseas countries. A contact was established with other emigration groups, including the still most prestigious and organized Poles, who were greatly influenced by the federal drafts. The earlier statements that emigration movements were particularly receptive to integration ideas also applies to Hungarian emigration after 1848. The high degree of susceptibility to various federal plans in the period after 1849 is also justified by the fact that until the adoption of the 1867 Compromise, the future of Habsburg-Hungarian relations, the structure and the states were completely uncertain. Everyone could see clearly that the absolutist Bach-era regime that emerged after the defeat of the War of Independence would not be sustainable for long. In this transitional state, the federal plans offering the alternative solution already mentioned were not accidentally given more leeway. The first prominent representative of the federation plans was László, 1811 until 1861, the Hungarian government's ambassador in Paris. Learning from the years of 1848 and 49, he wrote the following to Kossuth on the 14th of March. It is not only Austria that is dead, but also St. Stephen's Hungary. Doubt and uncertainty about the sustainability of the Habsburg Empire was shared by others as well. Whereas a few years earlier, Miklós Wesselényi could only envision that successful territorial unity of Hungary, in 1849 he no longer believed that the Habsburg Empire will live on for long. In the spring of 1849 he spoke of a Budapest-centered new Central Europe. As previously mentioned, the most prestigious leader of the emigration was Lajos Kossuth, so it was his plans for the future settlement of Central Europe that attracted the most interest. In October 1849, in Vidin, immediately after the emigration, he formulated confederation idea, which would consist of Hungary, Poland, Serbia, and the Romanian principalities. It adopted many elements of the draft constitution of American and many existing European ones, while also building on Hungarian historical traditions but respecting the individual and communal rights of nationalities. This was developed further in his 1862 proposal for a confederation of Hungary, Transylvania, Romania, Croatia, and Serbia, called the Danube Confederation. The common affairs, foreign policy, foreign trade, customs, military affairs would be managed by the federal parliament and the common government. The joint government bodies would meet in a different member state each year. This venue would provide the next head of the confederation. The question of official language would be settled with mutual agreement between the member states. Not surprisingly, Kossuth suggested French. Despite Kossuth's original intentions, the drafts were published too soon thanks to a Milanese newspaper, causing concern and opposition in territorial issues in many of the countries potentially affected. Thus, Kossuth was forced to explain himself and the plan, which in itself damaged the draft. Between 1849 and 1867, it was not only a great politician like Lajos Kossuth who formulated integration plans, but also Mihály Táncsis, who could not be comparable to Kossuth in his statement abilities. He was a writer and a publicist who was particularly sensitive towards social questions, including the peasant problem. Thus, many consider him to be one of the first socialist politicians. His person is inseparable from the revolution in Pest on the 15th of March 1848. Táncsis, who had been sentenced to prison for press offences, became one of the defining events of the famous day of the revolution. He wrote his work, Hét Nemzetség Szövetsége, which means the Union of Seven Nations, in 1857, which did not find the same resonance neither among his contemporaries nor the posterity, such as Kossuth's integration plans, for a number of reasons. According to a prominent historian of the subject, the work of Táncsis can be listed among the well-intentioned but naive and, in many respects, illusionary utopias. Táncsis took the historical principle into account in the question why foreign policy would only partially be common, but units of measurement, customs, and the monetary system would be. He does not mention military matters. His conception is in many ways underdeveloped, contradictory, and incomplete. Therefore, the idea of Táncsis remained completely unheeded. With the Compromise of 1867, the Habsburg-Hungarian, it brought an end to a long period of conflicts with mutual concessions. Contrary to the draft federation plans, the compromise was supported by a broader scope of the Hungarian public opinion. Many recognized that no other real alternative could be achieved in that time. Initially, there were criticism, but one had to realize that in order to be a political actor in Hungary after 1867, the fact itself and the acceptance of the compromise had to be the starting point. Kossuth expressed his concerns in his so-called Cassandra letter to the Hungarian society, but he remained in minority. In the long run, he sounded the fate of Hungary and the Habsburg Empire together. He was firmly convinced through the lesson of 1848 and 49 that the future dissolution of the empire is inevitable. With the compromise, the unity of historic Hungary depended on the fate of the Habsburg Empire. History has proven that Kossuth's prediction is proved to be right in the long run. As the dissolution of Habsburg Empire after the First World War brought with it the disintegration of Old Hungary. However, no other feasible solution was possible in the last third of the 19th century. It is also important to point out that the stabilization of the Habsburg empires was welcomed by Western powers. Predictability in the Central European region was necessary for European balance. At the turn of the 19th and 18th century, there were concepts of a Hungarian expansionist aspiration towards the Balkan, for which economic arguments such as opening new markets were also aligned. This was the birth of the particular, which called for the building of a common future between peoples of Asia or Asian roots, including the Hungarians from Central Europe, through Southeast Europe to Central Asia. The Turan Society was established in 1910 with their own journal, the Turan, first published in 1913. Their long-term goals were the following. The Hungarian nation has a great and bright future ahead of it, and it is certain that the heyday of Germanism and Slavism will be followed by the heyday of Turanism. We Hungarians, the Western representatives of this great awakening power, have the great and difficult but glorious task of becoming the spiritual, economic leaders of the Turanian nation of 600 million people. The movement is undoubtedly important in terms of ideological history, but it had no significant impact on Hungarian foreign policy. The Brück Secretary of State himself formulated concepts about the exemplary economy. Similarly to the representatives of German industry, lively debate was stimulated in connection with envisaged customs union with the monarchy, since the different interests and potential of German industry and agricultural sector were apparent. The concrete form of economic cooperation was not clear either. By the liberal and Lutheran pastor Friedrich Neumann, 1860 until 1919, published in 1915, fitted into this line of thought. It is undoubtedly the most significant work in its impact and resonance. It sold 100,000 copies in just a year, becoming the most successful publication after the memoirs of Bismarck in pre-1918 Germany. After its publication, it was also published in Hungary, which sparked lively debate among economists, politicians, and intellectuals. In 1916, the leading newspaper of the Hungarian bourgeois. In 1916, the leading newspaper of the Hungarian bourgeois radical, the 20. Század, which is 20th century, organized a debate on the issue. Participants were divided on the concept. Oskar Jászai, 1875 until 1957, a renowned social scientist and the most respected figure among the bourgeois trade, the dismantling of customs borders and general economic and cultural development within a large political framework rather than in an isolated small state, regardless of his disagreement with German ideas of great power and world domination. However, other leading politicians in the debate, such as the Social Democrat Zsigmond Kunfi, 1879, and Socialist Sándor Gisvány, 1856 until 1923, opposed the plan precisely because they saw the realization of the German expansionist ambitions in them. Along with Jászai, many believed that peace and free development could only be achieved by the creation of the United States of Europe, for which Mitteleuropa could become a solid basis of Europe, for which Mitteleuropa could become a solid basis. However, he did not envisage its creation for the same purpose and in the same way as the already cited German aspirations for world domination. To sum up the debate, neither the Austrian nor the Hungarian ruling powers were able to come up with a constructive, historically viable counter-idea to the idea of Central European integration. And if they did attempt it, they were drowned in the whirlpool of nationalism or even in the shallow kelp forest of national nihilism. In 1917 and 1918, the aggressive German ambition for the great power, Hungary within, could only play a subordinate role. This encouraged Jászai from supporting the creation of Mitteleuropa in this form. Pál Szende, 1879 and 1934, another bourgeois radical economist writer, warned of the dangers of the increasing dependence on Germany in an emotional article in the Világ, which is the journal. Hungarian statesmen are competing to offer Germany all that is valuable, important for the future of the Hungarian state. István Tisza wants to send the Hungarian infantry to the front in Flanders, while Wekerle is sacrificing Hungarian industry and trade on the altar of allied loyalty. We know from the statements of the Prime Minister that he is preparing a long customs alliance with Germany. The matter is urgent, immensely urgent. At the end of 1918, with the defeat of Germany, the Mitteleuropa plans were off the agenda. Furthermore, the defeat of the Centroid powers also meant the radical dissolution of the Habsburg Empire and Hungary with it. Jászai drafted a plan in October 1918 to ensure the cooperation of peoples by the Danube in the future. The monarchy would have been reorganized on a federative basis, which would have kept the historical borders of Hungary, but without Croatia. The name of his conception was the United States of the Danube. In the autumn of 1918, Jászai became Minister of Nationalities in the Károly bourgeois democratic government, but he had no real room for maneuver. His concept of federalizing the monarchy was neither welcomed by the neighboring nations nor by the Entente powers, and it was too late. Already in the spring of 1918, it was decided that instead of a reform of the monarchy or a more moderate territorial dismemberment, the creation of a small state framework would determine the new power structure in Central and Southeastern Europe. With this, the Hungarian state of St. Stephen's were torn into pieces, as the government that came into power in the autumn of 1918 did nothing to prevent this, and could have done very little. They were often held responsible for the territorial losses. By signing the Treaty of Trianon, 1920, Hungary found itself in a highly controversial situation. After nearly 4 centuries, it regained full state autonomy, but was placed under such conditions of territorial loss that it had never experienced. In Central Europe, the imperial framework was replaced by states sought to completely abolish former economic relations, pursuing a so-called import substitution industrialization, which seemed almost impossible and wasteful in small state framework. Between the 2 world wars, the most significant integration movement by international standards was the pan-European movement. In Hungary, the pan-European idea of the movement, Coudenhove-Kalergi, 1894-1972, asked Pál Auer, 1885-1978, renowned international jurist, in a letter to start the organizing work. Auer himself took the job from Antal Reinprecht, 1881-1946, Member of Parliament, former Supremus Comes. Many politicians from the opposition, economic journalists, artists, writers and poets joined the movement. In Hungary, however, they were less active than in other countries because of the constant distrust that surrounded them due to the stoic aloofness of official Hungarian politics. The organizers were aware of this. Auer wrote of their ambitions. We were striving for a unified, institutionally organized economic community of the Danube, and at the same time, products of this economic community should be bought up by the countries of Western Europe at a preferential rate to those of overseas countries. Yet we also hoped that close economic cooperation would not only ensure peace between the Danube states and the resolution of minority problems, but also our greater independence from Germany. Elem in 1942 was the most active, internationally recognized, best-known representative of the integrational idea between the two world wars. He was an economist, a university professor, state secretary of commerce between 1916 and 1918. And during this period, he was also an expert for the League of Nations. The main thrust of his activities was economic rapprochement between the successor states. For his extensive organizational and academic work in favor of integration, he was known by his contemporaries as the Central European Coudenhove Kalergi. In the 1920s, Elemér Hantos propagated his economic policy program in the framework of the Mitteleuropäische Wirtschaftsgagung, or MWT, alongside the League of Nations and other organizations. The MWT was founded in 1925 with the instigation of Viennese wholesaler Julius Mein, 1869 until 1944, an internationally renowned advocate of free trade. The founder's vision was to provide an institutional framework for the formulation and support of the European economic convergence in Central Europe. As from 1924 and 1925, the integration in Vienna on the 8th and 9th of September 1925 was attended by economists and economic and financial actors from all around Europe who condemned the exclusionary economic policy. The main participants joining the associations were bankers, traders and financial experts. 1866-1933, president of the National Bank of Austria, who had a realistic perception in their own fields of the harmful effects of economic isolationism and autarchic economic policies. Hantos was constantly the most active on the Hungarian side. The main practical achievement of the organization was to create a public and international forum for economic issues affecting Central Europe. It could not have done more. The organization embraced Hantos's concept that the Central European question can only be solved if one element of economic life is not operation must be formulated while recognizing its complexity. Accordingly, in the second half of the 1920s, the practical work of the MWT focused on possible forms of convergence in transport policy, monetary policy, and customs policy. In October 1926, transport was the main topic of international discussion, the Danube question, and in 1930, current trade policy issues, and in 1931, the agricultural questions. The conferences explored the roots of certain economic problems, but could not achieve more than formulate general expectations and proposals, nor did they have political authority. According to Hantos, from an economic point of view, Germany is part of Central Europe, but it is not desirable to be involved in the creation of the economic integration between the successor states, since then the whole region would fall under such German influence that it would provoke opposition from the Western powers. It has set up a series of institutions to raise awareness of the interdependence of Central European states, to work on a specific concept and to formulate concrete programs and plans. As part of this process, the Vienna Institute was set up in March 1929, which primarily dealt with transport and monetary issues. The Institute in Brno in 1929 to study cooperation between the various production sectors, and the Central European Institute in Dresden in 1929 and 1930. In May 1930, the Hungarian Institute was also set up under the leadership of Gustav Graz, 1805 until 1946, politician, publicist and economic journalist. The focus was on agricultural issues. Graz, along with Hontos, was the most active member of the economic integration movement of Central Europe in Hungary between the two world wars. The global economic crisis meant a new era, both in political and economic relations. Circumstances were the starting point of Elemér Hontos as well. He thought his concept created in the 1920s to be still relevant. The only change was that market issues had become the main problem in international economic relations. The old financial problems, the exhaustion of funds and unfavorable exchange rates, were still relevant, however in new light. The basic elements of his idea have not changed substantially. He saw the proof of the upsetting of the balance between supply and demand in the economic fragmentation of the monarchy, which was not only a mistake in terms of the economic processes of the 1920s. He also saw the root of the economic problems of the Central Europeans in the 1930s in the territorial changes brought along by the peace treaties, in addition to the adverse effect of the world economy. The negative effects of the new borders on economic life could not be mitigated in the 1920s. He saw that the creation of an economic balance in the region can be achieved by solving this issue. In his 1933 memoirs, published in several languages, he explored the root and effects of the global crisis on the successor states. The identified causes were the unfavorable economic effects of the new political borders, the questions of reparation, the economic policy practices of the successor states, and the mistrust which made the normal economic contacts difficult. He also stressed that the crisis in this region has complex roots and that the possible solutions should reflect this complexity. Because the crisis in the Danube region is not simply an imprint of the world economy, it is not a temporary, changing, cyclical crisis which requires different instruments than those prescribed for general crises. The least to do for economic rapprochement is a trade agreement, the maximum is custom union. Hontos sees serious obstacles in achieving both. The political impossibility of a customs union is matched by the inadequacy of trade agreements. However, the idea of a custom union is so politically burdened that even the very idea would discredit the rapprochement. According to Hontos, there is a middle ground. If on the one hand, liberal trade treaties and simple preferential customs are not enough, and on the other hand, a more radical form of customs union is unfeasible, there is no other alternative but a middle ground in trade policy leading to a customs and economic alliance. In the Hungarian parliament, the debate on the economic integration plans, including the Tardieu proposal, broke out during the discussion of the 1932 budget. For until 1946, although not as Prime Minister, expressed his views in greater detail as one of the leading figures in the foreign policy principles and methods of the period. Indeed, whatever the merits of the plan, however much it may have served to put Central Europe back on its feet, its defect is that it has a somewhat Danube confederation flavor, and that the preference it offers is somewhat expensive. I therefore ask the Hungarian government, since it is in our interest to have a free hand towards other markets, since it is in our interest to be able to contract on equal terms with Italy, France, Germany, and not to give up any of their free hand in this respect to work to amend the Tardieu plan in a direction that suits our interests. The plan was defended by the aforementioned Gustav Graz. He provided data to justify the reality of the concept and saw it as a means for Hungary to regain its old markets and thus remedy the crisis. Can regain at least in part the natural advantages of the larger economic areas. The advantages were enjoyed economically in the old monarchy, in the old common customs territory. His view was shared by few. The official Hungarian foreign policy against all plans for integration was first to revise, then to create economic or any kind of rapprochement, and not vice versa. Many of the active politicians could identify with the integration as a necessary and inevitable trend. In 1931, Pallai, 1897 until 1941, politician, two-time Prime Minister, and internationally renowned geographer, wrote, "Everything that brings the people of Europe closer together, whether in the economic or cultural field, is intended to overcome customs duty and transport difficulties. The protection of European production and the organization of any aspect of it, the grouping or organization of certain branches of production for the whole of Europe, agreements between or among European agricultural and industrial states, similar agreements between countries which are geographically, by virtue of economic complementary, related the frequent contact of European politicians within and outside the league towards development. Although Bethlen and the official Hungarian foreign policy saw the realization of any kind of integration in our region only after the achievement of the Hungarian revisionist cause, in line with the general features of the integration ideas, he himself, as an influential personality, but no longer an active politician, outlined the federation idea in 1944. He wrote a letter to Tibor Eckhardt, 1888-1972, a leading figure in Hungarian emigration in the West during the Second World War, with the aim of presenting his ideas of federation to the powers. The integration plans of politicians who were forced into opposition or emigration, like those of Bethlen, were far removed from realpolitik to opposition or emigration, like those of Bethlen, were far removed from realpolitical processes and opportunities. The post-war fate of Hungary and its neighbors had already been fundamentally decided. The future scenario was starting to be written by Moscow more and more. From the second half of the 1930s onwards, and especially during the Second World War, Hungarian politicians and intellectual leaders became increasingly preoccupied with the fear of the great power relations and its consequences. Feelings and phobias that had been present since the mid-19th century, the fear of German and Russian expansionism, now posed an even more realistic challenge: independence and national existence of the small peoples of Central and Eastern Europe. The great power ambitions of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in the region had become timelier and more palpable than ever. The question rightly arose whether small statehood still had a chance along the Danube. These concerns were also confirmed by Western and especially British shocked society throughout the region. There will be security in Eastern Europe only if their area is dependent on the military power of Russia. The events of the interwar period have proved that neither any group of small states nor any group of Western powers can provide security for any nation. László Németh, 1901-1975, one of the most influential writers and thinkers of the period, painfully and disappointedly declared, "So that's how we have brought and sold little peoples to the hordes." It was not by chance that Hungarian intellectual life in these years was preoccupied with the future of small statehood and the relationship between small nations and great powers. As an alternative, they again thought of some kind of integration solution. In this crisis, an uncertainty, the so-called Sarso meeting took place between the 23rd and 29th of August 1943 near Lake Balaton, with the participation of nearly 500 writers, poets, sociologists and social scientists. The main slogans, question of fate, search for a way forward and community of values, in themselves show the fear of the future, whatever the outcome of the war might be. Several of them also express the need for interdependence, rapprochement, some kind of interconnection, integration or creation of a new identity among the peoples of Central Europe. The fact that the Second World War ended with the presence of Soviet troops in Central and Southeastern Europe had a profound impact on the history of these countries for decades. Nevertheless, for a brief period between 1945 and 1947, the idea of integration in these countries was revived. Each side, however, used the idea of rapprochement for different political ends. The most active negotiations took place in the Hungarian-Romanian-Yugoslavian relationship, when even the politicians here what the great powers wanted from the region, although the Soviet presence was clear, but to what extent the Western victors would interfere in the political life of the region. The use of the positive message of the idea of federation for current political purposes is well illustrated by a passage from the September 1945 election program of the Hungarian Communist Party. The main goal of Hungarian foreign policy is to ensure the peace and harmony of the Danube peoples, to pave the way for the idea of Kossuth, the Danube Federation. To this end, efforts should be made only to intensify trade, but also to establish a Romanian, Yugoslav, Hungarian. During the period of Cold War and Sovietization of Central and Eastern Europe, and after the deterioration of Yugoslav-Soviet relations in 1948, the idea of federation was dropped from the agenda. Moscow rejected all attempts to achieve this, and multilateral cooperations between the socialist countries was replaced by a system of bilateral treaties, with the agreements with the Soviet Union being the most important for every country. For Hungary too, membership of the Soviet bloc, the Warsaw Pact of 1955 and the Comecon of 1949 determined the possibilities and direction of it. The Comecon was originally a framework for economic integration, but was in fact a political response to the Marshall Plan. Until the early 1960s, it did not do any real work, since the typical autarkic economy policies of the 1950s and the international division of labor were in themselves a contradiction. Since the early 1980s, a debate has been developing among writers, poets, philosophers, and historians in several socialist countries, especially in Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary, on the conceptual, substantive, and spatial possibilities of interpreting Central Europe, of the possibilities of cooperation between the small nations of Central Europe. By denying the line that divided Europe, the proponents of the idea of Central Europe were in fact proclaiming the unity of Europe, and Central Europe meant Europe. Central Europe was increasingly saturated with the positive emotional content. György Konrad, apologist, clearly stated that Central Europeans are those who are offended, disturbed, anxious, and tense by the division of our continent. The advocates of Central Europe had to face up to the negative legacy of the German world domination of the concept of Central Europe, or Mitteleuropa. The discovery of Central Europe, so often referred to, was thus also a demand for the purification of Mitteleuropa. That is, the peoples of the region were here long before Neumann and Hitler, and will remain here